Hey everyone, welcome to Transform Your Workplace. I'm your host, Brandon Laws, and today I'm excited to have Siri Chilazi on the show. Siri is a senior researcher at Harvard Kennedy School's Women and Public Policy program, and she's dedicated her career to advancing gender equality in the workplace. With degrees from Harvard College, Harvard Kennedy School, and Harvard Business School, she brings a wealth of knowledge to the table. And in today's conversation, we got into some real world examples from tweaking resume formats to using data to fix deep rooted inequities. Siri broke down why fixing systems is more effective than training individuals and how transparency and meaningful incentives can drive real, measurable change. Plus, she shared practical ideas that you can use to make your own workplace fairer and more inclusive. As always, this show is courtesy of Xenium HR. Learn more about Xenium's custom HR programs and learning and development programs at xeniumhr.com. And if you're ready to learn actionable strategies to transform your workplace in a positive way, hit that subscribe button on your favorite podcast app and be sure to share this episode with somebody who needs to hear it. All right, let's dive into the conversation with Siri Chilazi. Siri, it is such a pleasure to have you on Transform Your Workplace. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Oh, the pleasure is all mine, Brandon. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited for our conversation.
You're out with a new book. By the time this releases, the book has already been released, but Make Work Fair, Data-Driven Design for Real Results, a very in-depth book. I'm excited to get into it, but what was that process like of writing a book, and this is your first one, with a co-author?
Yes, I had an incredible co-author, my colleague Iris Bennett, a professor at Harvard Kennedy School, which is where I'm a senior researcher. And we were lucky to have worked together for many, many years before we started this book project. And so I think that helps is, finding the right person with whom you've built up trust, you know each other's working styles, you think similarly in some ways, but differently in many important ways so that it can be an additive collaboration. I feel truly blessed to have done this with her.
So you and Iris emphasize designing work to be fair in everything that we do as organizations. Maybe at a high level, just give us an example of what you mean by that.
So let me give you an example from recruitment. This is one of my latest studies as of recently. It's a study that looked at 9,000 firms in the UK and looked at the traditional resume format, which, as we know, lists what you did, management consultant, and then typically lists the dates associated, so 2010 to 2013. Well, this traditional resume format makes any gaps in work experience really obvious. So if your next experience starts in 2015, a recruiter will look at that and say, well, what's going on here? What was this person doing from 2013 to 2015? And we know from other research that employers tend to penalize people with any gaps in their work history for any reason, even though there's actually no evidence to suggest that folks with career gaps are any less skilled or committed or competent in the workplace. So in this study, the researchers tested a revised resume format where you still say what the experience was, but instead of attaching the specific dates, you mention the amount of time. So for example, management consultant, 3 years instead of 2010 to 2013. And what that small redesign does, it removes the focus on the gaps and instead allows us to focus on the actual skills and experiences and competencies that candidates bring. And what the study showed was that indeed women and men both were more likely to be invited to interview under that redesigned resume format, precisely because employers were better able to find those people that fit their criteria. They found better talent when they were not distracted by looking at the career gaps. So that's an example of a small change in something that we're already doing. We're already hiring people. We're already reviewing resumes. Let's do it a little bit better and in a way that provides a genuinely level playing field for everybody. In this case, for people with career gaps, so that they're not unfairly and unnecessarily penalized.
That's a great example. And what I think about is Making individual change like that could be effective. I worry about with DEI strategies that many organizations are putting into place, like we're trying to do one-off trainings and tackle the individual. Whereas and I think you talk about this in the book too, there's systemic issues at play here that if we redesign them may be more effective. Maybe talk about that, the individual changes versus systemic.
Yeah, that's one of the biggest messages of our book is the path to real change is in fixing systems instead of fixing individuals. So to go back to this resume example, right? The individual fix would be to say, okay, any person who's applying for a job, reformat your resume. And some people will find out about this and they'll do it, and other people, the messages won't get through and they'll continue to use the old format. Now, employers might see resumes coming in all different formats and say, well, wait a second, some of these have dates attached and some of them don't. I wonder what's going on here. And that could lead to a different kind of bias and unfairness, right, in their evaluations. So the systemic solution would be for the employer to just say, no, this is how we want to receive the information. Tell us what you did and the amount of time you did it for, and that's all we need to know. So that's kind of just, one example of how do you toggle between individuals trying to change their behavior to fit a system that is unfair versus actually saying, no, let's change the system itself. And now all of the individuals operating in it, whether they're job seekers or the people that we have working in our companies, they can just do the best they can do. And let's see how far they get.
Do you find like certain organizations have an easier time with making systemic change, or sure, size of organization matters? Like it's hard, if you have 1,000+ person organizations, probably hard to make sweeping changes versus a smaller business might be a little bit more flexible. What's your experience with that?
Yes and no. It's interesting because, the intuition would be I agree that smaller organizations are more nimble and they're easier to change. Certainly, if you're a 5-person startup, it's much easier to build really fair practices right on the ground level and then just scale them when you go to 100 and 1,000 people. That's much easier than trying to turn around an organization that's already 100,000 people. On the flip side, though, smaller organizations tend to also have fewer resources. They don't necessarily have all these processes built up. They don't have full-time HR people or all the data analytics tools, data analytics professionals who can analyze data, track it. So that's the part of the equation that goes in the favor of larger companies that have all these resources at their disposal. So it's hard to kind of tell exactly how it shakes out in terms of who it's easiest for, but everybody should do it. No excuses.
Yeah, so well said. You talk about myths about fairness in the workplace. There's a bunch of them listed, but I'm curious which myth sticks out to you the most as far as being most pervasive and how leaders could perhaps address it.
Yeah, we mentioned 7 in the book, but I was just struck by the fact that you brought up training earlier. So let me share that one, because that I think is one of the biggest myths, but also if we can bust it, it can potentially have the biggest return on investment. So the myth is that we can train ourselves to fairness, that by educating people about the concepts of unconscious bias, somehow we can change how they feel, we can raise their awareness, we can modify their beliefs. And as a result, people will magically behave differently and the workplace will magically become more fair. Now, there's a lot of research to suggest that debiasing humans is really difficult or might well be impossible. Unconscious bias is just a facet of how human brains operate. But there's also a lot of research to show that we can get people to behave differently without changing their underlying attitudes and beliefs. And some of the most interesting research in this vein comes from conflict-prone regions of the world, like the Middle East or Africa, where there's been really destructive civil wars, right? People have huge, stereotypes and prejudices against a different ethnic group or people of a different religion. And trust me, those are not going away with a 1-hour training session or even 10 1-hour training sessions. I mean, these are generational, these are deeply, deeply held beliefs. But studies show that, for example, in Iraq, when Christians and Muslims came together to play in a soccer league and they got to know each other and they were on the same team and they were working towards the shared goal of winning soccer games, a lot of the prejudice or the kind of bias in their attitude, not attitudes, their behaviors was attenuated. So that actually they were equally likely to, for example, recommend a Muslim or a Christian teammate for its sportsmanship award. Similarly, in Rwanda, which had one of the most horrific civil wars of all time back in in 1994, the two main ethnic groups there, the Hutus and the Tutsis, tons of conflict, deeply embedded animosity. But after the Civil War, there were TV programs and radio programs that showed Hutus and Tutsis living peacefully together, sending their kids to the same schools, even some cases of intermarriage. And it might not have changed people's deeply held underlying beliefs, but it shifted the social norms of what is okay to do and say now, how we Rwandans behave. And so you saw people actually more likely to do those same behaviors that they had seen in the radio and TV shows. So the powerful message here is that behaviors can change pretty quickly and actually relatively easily, even when the underlying attitudes do not.
That's powerful. Love that. The subtitle of your book is Data-Driven Design for Real Results. So you love data, and you cover data in the book. There's a quote that I pulled out. I want you to respond to it. The quote says, "Data becomes a powerful engine for change when we harness it as a tool, not as an end in itself," end quote. What did you mean by that? And could you give an example of how data has been effective and used in addressing inequities in the organization?
Yeah. So a lot of times we collect data, we analyze it, we make beautiful charts and graphs based on it, we put it in a presentation, we write a blog post about it, and then it goes nowhere.
Yep. Yep.
So in my world, and for me as a researcher and as someone who hopes to influence organizational practice, data is not an end in itself. The collecting, the analyzing, the presenting data in compelling ways, that's super important. It has to be done, but it's in service of something bigger, which is allowing that data to tell us where we have opportunities to improve, where we have gaps in fairness, right? And then allowing us to design and choose the best actions so that we can erase those gaps, so that by the time we next collect and analyze the data, something has actually measurably changed. And I want to just highlight that word measurable, because especially in the fairness space, there's a lot of well-intentioned action and activity and trainings and speaker sessions and meetings of employee resource groups and retreats and all kinds of stuff. Most of it is not measured. So we don't actually know what happens as a result of all this time and money and effort that's being spent. And that's why in the subtitle of our book, I'm particularly attached to those words, real results, because to me, that at the end of the day is what this is all about, is we want to actually see change happening. So you asked for an example of how data can drive this kind of change. Let me give you an example from a company that everybody knows, Google. Years ago, they looked at their employee data and they saw a retention gap between women and men. Now, they didn't stop there. They started analyzing the data more granularly and, in fact, discovered that it was less a gender gap between women and men, and it was more a parenthood gap in retention. So women who had children were actually the single group that were most likely to leave Google. And that was a problem, of course, because the company invests a lot of time and money in recruiting and finding the best people. And so you want them to stay and do really great work for you. So once the data had allowed them to really identify the granular problem, they were then able to test a potential solution. And in their case, that was increasing the availability of parental leave from 12 weeks to 18 weeks, actually for all parents, not just women. And they've even extended that since then, according to the latest data that I just looked up. And then they continued to collect data on attrition rates and on usage patterns of parental leave. And they saw that parental leave usage went up and the gender gap in retention was closed. So to me, this is kind of a success story of how you use data to identify a problem. Once you have a really good sense of what the problem is, you can then make your best guess of a solution that would work to fix it. You implement the solution, you continue to track, and in this case, it worked out for the best.
I'm always fascinated by it because you cover goals a lot in the book as well. And I'm always curious, what comes first? Is it you measure something first, establish a baseline, and then create goals based on whatever problem you're trying to solve, and then measure again? Like, how do goals play a role in this work in creating a fair organization?
So let's do a silly analogy from the world of weight loss, which is relatable for many people, right? You could just sit there and say, I want to lose weight. And so I'm going to do it. And I'm setting a goal for myself to lose some weight. But if you haven't weighed yourself, you don't know where you start. If you don't weigh yourself again, you don't actually know if you did lose weight. You might feel like you did, it might look like it, but you don't actually definitively know. You certainly don't know how much weight you lost. So it's not that you can't make progress without measurement and goals, because if you put in, all those healthy behaviors, you started moving more, maybe eating less, maybe eating more healthfully, that would all certainly be wonderful. It's great for your health, and you might even lose some weight, but you could never really fully know where you started, where you ended, how much progress you made. And so I think that's why measuring to establish a baseline, to understand where you are today, then picking a goal or a target that's reasonable, feasible to achieve, but at the same time, a little bit stretching, a little bit challenging. Research has shown those types of slightly challenging and yet still feasible goals are actually the most motivating ones, the ones that we're most likely to achieve, is likely to spur more progress and more results faster.
For organizations who aren't super data driven, how do they identify those problems so then they can set the goals, though? I think that's where I struggle with is some organizations are just not good at measuring anything. And so then how do you establish a goal and know that you're working towards something that's going to create the more fair work environment?
Yeah, I've worked with a lot of companies who say something to the effect of, this sounds so great, but we don't really collect any data. That's just not how we run our business. So then I ask them, well, do you know who your employees are? Do you have their names? Sure, we do. Do you know when they were hired? Well, of course. If they were promoted at some point along the way, would there be a record of that somewhere? Sure. Do you know how much you pay them? Well, of course. Have you ever run an employee survey? Yeah, we do that every year. My goodness, that is so many data points
Swimming
right
in data.
there.
Yeah.
So I think it's swimming in data. So I think instead of the availability of data, that's actually less often the challenge. More often the challenge is we just haven't applied an analytical lens to it. So my kind of advice to every company is don't even worry at first about starting to collect new data. You can get to that down the road, but you have so much already, I guarantee it. So start with what you have and just analyze it by simple metrics that make sense to you. If you have people's gender or race available, do that. If you have different office locations, analyze this data by office location. Or maybe your company has two main divisions. Well, look at those divisions separately. For your employee satisfaction survey, maybe if people are based in a certain office location or if they're remote or hybrid. That's a dimension along which you could analyze the results and then see if there's anything interesting there that pops up.
I want you to unpack this for me. So I think in one of the myths that we need to debunk, just going back to that, fairness and meritocracy, they're not mutually exclusive. I think you argue that in the book. How can organizations balance those two concepts?
So, pop quiz question for you, Brendan. How would you define meritocracy? The only reason I asked this because I realized the other day I didn't actually know the formal definition, so I went to look it up on the Merriam-Webster dictionary.
Oh, you're gonna put me on the spot. To me, it's something it's earned. It's like your performance or track record has earned you. I don't know if it's a position or more money, whatever it may be, but it's earned.
Yeah, brilliant. The Merriam-Webster definition, more or less, is that advancement is conferred based upon talent or skill. That's basically what you said. That is the fundamental definition of meritocracy. I believe very much in that definition. I think most of us agree that's how the world should work. It's just that the evidence is really clear that in today's workplace, that's actually not how it works. We don't have a level playing field for everyone to compete on so that people would have an equal shot at succeeding to their full talents and showing their full skills. Here's an analogy that I think can be helpful. Imagine that you've got two sprinters who are equally fast and they're about to run the 100-meter race. So if they're equally fast and they start at the same starting line, which of them is going to finish first? We're going to finish at the same time, right? Because they're equally as fast. I know, I'm saying this is not a trick question. But so that would be a true meritocracy. Is everyone starts at the same line and, even if they're not equally as fast, whatever, the fastest person wins. The real world is much more akin to some people's starting line being moved 20 meters back. So even if they're equally as fast, everybody's equally as fast, if someone has to run 120 meters while another person only has to run 100, well, of course, the person who has to run the shortest distance is always going to finish first. So the way I think about all these efforts to advance fairness at work is it's making sure that we align everybody's starting lines to be in the same place. And then once we've got everyone at the same starting line, we make sure that they're actually running on the same track. Imagine if one person gets to run on, the latest performance, some kind of crazy material, like in this recent Paris Olympics, they had some super engineered material, and then part of the track is mud. So both people are running a 100-meter race, but one person has to run it in mud, whereas the other person gets to run it on a high performance track. Most people would look at that and say, well, that's not a fair race. Of course, the person on the high performance track has a significant advantage, right? So this is what we're talking about, is everybody at the same starting line and on the same track. And then from there, let everyone succeed to their potential and even to their priorities and preferences. Some people are amazingly talented, but they don't want to work 100 hours a week and they don't want to become the CEO because it's a lot of pressure and a lot of responsibility. That's fine. So we have to allow for that individual variation, not just in skills, but also in people's desires.
Who's spearheading this work? I mean, for organizations that are fortunate enough to have a diversity, equity, inclusion team, an equity team, whatever organizations want to call it, does it solely rely on them? Is it the managers, the leaders? It seems like instill this in daily operations. It's going to take a lot of coordination with a lot of people. Who's this relying
It's
on?
a brilliant question. And this is another one of the myths that we debunk in the book. There is this myth out there that DEI professionals can fix fairness for everybody, that they can wave their magic wand and make equity happen. A 5-person DEI team in an organization of thousands of employees. I'd like to share with you another analogy, if I may. Communications. Most companies have some sort of corporate communication department or some PR specialists that handle the CEO speeches and they write the annual report. But do they speak in every meeting? Do they write every employee's PowerPoint presentation, right? Do they write every email that gets sent to the company? Of course not. Every employee in the company has to have at least a base level of communication skills for those daily meetings and emails and other presentations in order for the organization to function. So this is how I would argue fairness needs to come about in the workplace as well. Yes, experts can play an important role as guiding efforts, sharing evidence, best practices, creating the strategies. But in a way, every single employee is a fairness officer in their own work. It doesn't mean joining a task force or taking on a whole new role. It just means that you do what you're already doing, but you're doing it a little bit better and a little bit more fairly.
I pulled out another quote. I love my quotes. This quote says, transparency becomes an engine for change when we harness it as a tool, not as an end, end quote. How does transparency play a big role in this inside of organizations, and how could it drive change to make the biggest impact?
Transparency is so important because we humans inherently care about what other people think. We want approval from those around us. We want to be part of the herd instead of the odd one out, the cast off. We don't want to be the only person going left when everybody else is going right. And so when we know that our actions are being watched by others, we tend to put it in layperson's term, we tend to be on our very best behavior. So transparency and the accountability that arises from, sharing data publicly and transparently, tracking progress, giving people regular updates, it creates the accountability of, well, did we actually move the needle? And if not, where did we go wrong? And whose head is going to be on the chopping block, even if it's not an individual, but maybe collectively? Like, how are we going to right the ship and make sure that next time we give this progress report, we have something better to share? So that's the magic of transparency. And, even to go back to this weight loss analogy, when people set personal goals like that, and then they bring others in as workout buddies. Once a week we go on a walk together, or you share with other people that this is your goal. We're more likely to achieve those goals when we have shared them transparently with others.
So true. I was thinking like what transparency to me is like if you have goals and you have data and you're communicating those effectively, people probably feel more connected to where the organization's heading. And alternatively, they could just choose this isn't for me and I'm ready to exit the organization. But I think that's where transparency could be your best friend is attract people that want to be part of something special or choose this isn't for me and leave. And that's probably the best case scenario in both cases.
Yeah. And I know that a lot of companies are cognizant of the fact that a lot of what they do internally with their existing workforce also serves as a signal to attract or turn off potential applicants. And there's a lot of interesting research to show that this is what's happening is when companies, for example, put in place public diversity goals and they share, our goal is to increase the representation of women or people of color, or whoever, it doesn't deter white men, but it makes women and people of color more likely to apply for job openings in that organization because they take that as a signal of the company's not just values really, but how they operate. Right? Because you can always say, oh, we value X, Y, and Z. You can make all these lofty statements. But at the end of the day, what are you doing on a daily basis? What is the experience that people are having as they work for you day in and day out? That's what people are really interested in. And companies can signal that through the things that they do.
So I'm curious, how do we use incentives to drive results and change an organization? Because I know that can motivate people sometimes.
Humans are very responsive to incentives, both financial and non-financial. I think one of the challenges with traditional incentives for environmental, social, and governance considerations, which have been popular recently, ESG or DEI, is that they've often formed a vanishingly small portion of the executives or the leaders' actual compensation package. So, a third of your compensation might be sort of bonus based or at risk. And then within that bucket, you've got a scorecard that has 10 or 15 or 30 different considerations in it. So if one of those is, increasing the representation of women on your team, well, if you did the math, it might come out to hundreds of dollars per year of compensation that are actually at risk. So one of the things that I would look at in designing compensation schemes is making the incentives actually meaningful. So if there's an outcome that you truly care about, you want to motivate people to reach that outcome, and one of the tools that you decide to use is an incentive, then that incentive should have some bite. If it's in financial terms, the amount of compensation at risk should be big enough that it actually motivates people and that they care. But then there's also all kinds of non-financial incentives that we can turn to. A great example comes from a large global consumer goods company that we worked with, where they wanted to incentivize their senior leaders to promote their direct reports in proportion to the talent pool that they had available. So let's say you're a member of the C-suite and you have, over the last 5 years, had 20 people reporting up to you. And of those 20, 10 have been men and 10 have been women. So you've got a 50-50 talent pool, essentially, to promote from. But let's say in that time, you made 5 promotions, and 4 of those 5 promotions went to men. Well, now you're promoting 80% men when your talent pool is 50% men. So there's a skew there, there's a discrepancy. This company was encouraging leaders to get to parity so the promotions would be in proportion to the available pool. They didn't actually put in a financial incentive, but instead they told these senior leaders that the CEO would personally check in with them in their quarterly meetings on how their promotion progress was tracking against proportionality. That's a very powerful incentive because these senior leaders care very much about what the CEO thinks of them and their work. And it also signaled that this was a true priority for the organization.
When it comes to hiring, I know we talked about bias earlier, but what are some common biases that most organizations face when it comes to hiring? And what are some structured or systematic approaches that employers can take in this process so that we're not just leaving it to gut instinct?
I'll just highlight a couple because there's a lot going on in hiring, but we humans have a fundamental tendency to gravitate to people who are similar to us, so-called homophily or in-group bias or affinity bias, whether that's based on, race or gender or the school that you went to or a hobby that you have or workplace that you were at previously. So that's one thing. Another thing is we don't always easily focus on the most important or relevant data points at hand. We humans get easily distracted by things that are not actually relevant, like the fact that we like somebody. They seem like fun to hang out with. Well, that's great, but are they the most competent? Do they have the skills to do this job better than all the other candidates? And then sometimes we just get distracted by considerations that should have no bearing on the process at all. Great example comes from a recent study which looked at over 9,000 firms in the UK and their hiring practices. The researchers redesigned the resume format so that instead of having candidates list, their experience with the dates attached, they had candidates list just the amount of time that people spent in a given role. So management consultant 4 years instead of listing 2020 to 2024. One of the things that happens then is employers were able to focus on the actual skills gained from the experience rather than being distracted by potential career gaps, where people would have taken some time off during any part of their work history for any reason. There's no reason to there's no evidence to suggest that people with career gaps are in any way less competent in the workplace. But we do know from data that employers today still tend to penalize with those career gaps because of stereotypes and expectations that they have that maybe those folks, for whatever reason, are less committed. Making that small tweak into the format of the resume is an example how we can lessen the impact of those irrelevant considerations and allow our inherently biased brains to focus on evaluating the things that matter, which is what skills have people actually gained.
I believe that there are a lot of inequities when it comes to the hybrid work environment. I don't know if you believe that too, but what are some innovative practices that you've seen employers implement that level the playing field? And it comes to the experience, and I know not everybody's home is the same, access to the same equipment. Like, how do you level the playing field here?
Yeah, large-scale remote work and hybrid work is still, in the grand scheme of things, a relatively new phenomenon. It really, of course, it was taking place a little bit before, but it really burst onto the scene in a major way in COVID. So we are still catching up on the research side of things to fully understand all the ins and outs of, what makes it the best, what are the pitfalls, how do we mitigate them. But there are certainly a couple of practices that are already emerging. One is, if employees are used to working in an in-person work environment, and if managers are used to managing their reports in an in-person environment, then shifting to either remote or a fully remote or hybrid environment is going to take some adaptation. You can't just expect that what worked in person is going to automatically work the same way hybrid. And I think that's where a lot of organizations stumbled a little bit, is because that transition was forced on them very, very quickly, almost overnight. They didn't invest the time, the training, the effort to actually have, managers meet with their teams and say, hey, what new norms do we need to set in this work environment? How do we need to approach time differently? We're not going to automatically be running into each other in the hallways anymore. So is that something that we need to recreate in the virtual environment? And if we decide that it is, how do we want to recreate that? Does that mean that everyone is just sitting on Slack or email 24 hours a day? Do we designate times for collaboration, right? There's a number of different ways that you could do this. And I think one thing that we're seeing very clearly in the research already is there's no one size fits all when it comes to remote work or just about anything else, which actually I think in a way is positive, because it means at the team level, at the division level, at the organizational level, there's a lot of room to experiment, try different things, and come up with the approaches that work best for us. And that could really vary from one team to the next, even within a company.
What advice do you have for organizations who are struggling just to move beyond the surface level inclusion efforts and strategies?
What are surface level inclusion strategies? I'm really curious as to how you define them.
Yeah, I guess I think we talked about it earlier too. It's like the organizations who are dipping their toes in the DEI work, and they're doing one training, and they're maybe talking about what it means to have an inclusive work environment, just like that, just talking about it and not like lip service, not actually getting into the work.
A lot of talk.
itself.
Yeah. Well, I think you hit the nail on the head. which is getting into the work itself. So my advice would be, if anything looks like a program, a one-off event, something that's separated from the daily flow of work, that's almost a sign that you should re-examine it. And so start looking at what are the things that are happening in the activities and the work efforts that are happening in your organization, regardless of the budgetary environment, regardless of the political environment, regardless of the time of year. So it's probably going to include things like communication, emails, meetings, hiring, performance evaluations, promotions, assigning people to teams, staffing up new projects, right? Allocating work, just to name a few. I would tackle those processes. And I would use data, whatever data we have on hand, to track and see, are all of those everyday work processes and activities happening in a fair way? So are the most high-profile projects, do they always tend to go to the same people? Does everyone have same or similar visibility in front of senior leadership? This is something really interesting that emerged in a law firm that my co-author, Iris Bennett, worked with some years ago. In this law firm, what happens is folks come out of law school, they become associates for 5, 6, 7 or so years, and then after that, there's a promotion point to partner. And in this firm, the incoming associate class, partners would look at the profiles of the incoming associates and pick which new associates they wanted on their teams. The associates didn't really have a say, and they also typically stayed working with the same partner for the entirety of their time as associates, or at least a big proportion. So what happens then? Well, some partners are just better at mentoring and sponsoring their direct reports, giving them opportunities, having them grow than others. Some associates had a better personality match with the partners that they were working with. Some associates were naturally more interested in the subject matter that the partner they were working with kind of was spearheading in the organization than others. You see my point. There's a lot of small inequity that immediately emerge based on whether you were really lucky in your partner match or really unlucky. And then what would happen is when people got to that promotion point several years later, some associates had what was called a thin file, which is over many years, they'd still worked very hard, but maybe they'd worked on fewer high-profile projects. Maybe fewer partners knew them. Maybe they hadn't gotten involved or hadn't gotten asked to get involved in internal firm initiatives that were considered high value and that would have raised their profile. So that's a sort of unfairness or inequity that this law firm identified, and then they came up with a simple system change to fix it, which is they moved to a rotational system, where at least for the first few years, the incoming associates would rotate among various different partners before maybe they then could make a mutual match with a particular partner. And that really helped to equalize those developmental opportunities so that by the time of promotion, everyone had a proverbial file of the same thickness at least.
Thanks for sharing that, because as you were describing this situation, I'm like, that is not fair. It's like total luck of the draw.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think so many of us who have worked out in the real world have had some of those experiences, at least in hindsight, where we can look back. I certainly think back on my career in management consulting for 3 years straight out of college. I just got so lucky that I happened to get staffed on a couple projects right in the very first months with partners and senior leaders who were considered to be rainmakers in the organization. You know, once they see you in action, they like your work, and they're more likely to staff you on their forthcoming projects. I got really lucky in being paired with a couple of managers in the beginning who were really focused on people development, really great at giving me constructive feedback, advocating on my behalf in the organization. And I can think of some other people who started around the same time who were undoubtedly equally competent, but they didn't benefit from that kind of career development sponsorship early on, and their trajectories were very different in the organization.
We've talked about data throughout this conversation, and I'm kind of curious, like if we're applying some of the ideas that you've talked about today, what are some of the metrics we should be looking at that would evaluate whether we are making an impact on our fairness initiatives and driving meaningful and lasting change?
This is my favorite question. I
Oh,
would,
good.
at a high level, it's measure what you treasure, track what you care about. So representation is one thing, the proportion of whether it's women or people from a particular socioeconomic demographic, people of any age, race, LGBTQ+, you name it. There's a lot of different things you could track, not all related to identity or demographics. So pure representation is one thing. But then I think if we're able to go a level deeper than that, we can gain some much more interesting insights. So for example, with career progression, are we promoting people in proportion to the available pool? So if you're going from manager to director, and at the manager level, we've got 35% women, are at least 35% of the people promoted from manager to director or also women? Or is there a skew? And if there's a skew, why might that be? Another data point that I would look at, just as an example, is time in role before promotion. So do we see that women spend a longer time at a given rank on average before they get promoted to the next rank? There's interesting data on Fortune 500 CEOs in this regard. The average tenure of male CEOs in the Fortune 500 is almost double the average tenure of female CEOs. So not only are women only about 11-12% of the CEOs in the Fortune 500, but they're having a different experience once they're in that CEO role. So this goes to show you that representation isn't everything. It's important, of course, to have all kinds of people represented in all kinds of roles. But then we have to dig a level deeper to say, while in those roles, are they having similar experiences? Are they getting access to the same opportunities? There's a really illuminating study from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology already 20 years ago, but they looked at the resources that female and male faculty members received to succeed. It's things like research budget, the square footage area of your laboratory space, whether you had an executive assistant or interns assigned to you, how centrally was your office located in the building, right? These are all measurable things. And so they went around with a tape measure, measuring lab space and all these other things, and found that there was a huge discrepancy where male faculty members tended to get bigger labs, fancier new equipment, more centrally located offices, bigger budgets, not just for research, but also to hire support staff, all this kind of institutional support. So it's going to look a little bit different in every workplace, right? What that exact support, what form it takes. But that's another really important thing that I would measure. And then, of course, there's, all these metrics, the self-reported metrics around employee satisfaction and things like that, which is, of course, very important. We want people to feel good and feel engaged. But I think it's interesting to compare those subjective feelings that employees have of how they perceive the organization to some of the more objective data around what is actually happening, and then to see if there's a mismatch or not.
As we wrap up this discussion, and I just want to give listeners a good nugget from here, like where do we go from here? If they want to make a change for good, what are some immediate steps that you recommend people go take right after listening to this?
Let me share something that will apply to everyone, regardless of the type of workplace you're in, your seniority, your role, where in the world you are. And that is to become a norm entrepreneur. Norms are shared but often unspoken understandings of what type of behavior is acceptable or expected. And a norm entrepreneur is someone who takes it upon themselves to shape and uphold the types of norms that they want to see in the workplace. So, for example, if you don't like people multitasking in meetings, either on Zoom, being distracted and typing out emails at the same time, or if it's an in-person meeting, secretly looking at their phone underneath the table, could you at the start of the next team meeting say, hey guys, I'd like to try something new. I think we could, reduce the duration of this meeting by 15 minutes, but agree that it's fully focused time and we're all totally present, not multitasking. Would you be willing to try this out for the next couple meetings and see how it goes? That's norm entrepreneurship in action. If you don't like interruptions in the workplace and meetings, next time someone gets interrupted, chime in. Interrupt the interrupter and say, oh, Brandon, I can't wait to hear your point, but could we please have Shelley finish hers first? Right? So think of one norm or one behavior that you'd like to shift. with yourself or with your team, and then start on a daily basis reinforcing the new norm that you like to see, those new behaviors.
This is good stuff, Siri. I appreciate you coming on the podcast. Your book is called Make Work Fair, Data-Driven Design for Real Results. I encourage people to go pick it up because there's so much that we didn't even cover. It's a great read and a lot of actionable stuff in there. So I so appreciate you coming on the podcast.
I really appreciate you, Brandon. Thank you for having me, and thanks everybody for listening.
What's the best way to connect with you?
I'm really active on LinkedIn, Siri Chilazi. I look forward to connecting with you there. And the book's website is makeworkfair.com. There you can also sign up for our newsletter with the latest research insights we'll send you periodically.
My guest today has been Siri Chilazi. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
My pleasure. Thanks, Brandon.
Hey, thanks so much for tuning in for today's episode of Transform Your Workplace. The content on this show is strictly for general information and educational purposes only, so that you can go transform your workplace in a positive way. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed on the show are the guest's own and don't represent the views, thoughts, and opinions of either Xenium HR, the sponsor of the show, or me, the host, Brandon Laws. Additionally, Xenium HR or myself, Brandon Laws, doesn't endorse any guest, their business, or any organization they represent. So discretion is advised. We encourage you to work with a trusted advisor to find a custom approach that fits your organization's needs. Thanks for tuning in to today's episode.